With Grant Oliphant. Many of you have probably already met him. I know he's been out and about meeting a number of people in our community in his 8 months. I can't believe it's been 8 months since you've been here. And I'm sure you still feel brand new. And I just want to say also, I'm so excited that we have so many people from the Conrad Prebys Foundation here in the audience today. We have them sitting up front. My name is Emily Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Institute, if you don't know me. And I wanted to take this opportunity to give a special shout out to the Conrad Prebys Foundation, not only for sponsoring this event, but also investing in a really critical part of our research, the philanthropy piece, which we haven't always been able to get, and it's costly to get the data. So thank you so much for both investing in the research, also sponsoring this event, and then also, you remember that piece in the data about investing in the nonprofit workforce? Well, I gotta tell you, the Conrad Prebys Foundation has also invested in that, in supporting vital scholarships for our graduate students, some of whom are in the room today, working professionals going through our graduate programs in nonprofit leadership and management. So thank you very much for that as well. And I'm also really grateful to have Grant here. I've listened to him speak a few times now, and I always get super excited to think about the CEO from another place that comes in with a really great perspective, a real impatience, and a sense that, you know, we don't have to have the status quo in San Diego. We don't have to put up with what we have and say, well, we can't do anything more. But there's so much more that we could be as a region. So I'm really excited about that, this idea of investing in a higher level of excellence for our region, and also the opportunity with Grant's leadership of the Conrad Prebys Foundation to really now see, I think the Conrad Prebys Foundation working with others to really exercise that institutional heft for influence and that convening power, using the foundation as a bully pulpit for social good in the San Diego region to bring together resources and influence and agitators for good. So with that, I'm excited to have you here to reflect on our findings.
That was my whole speech, by the way. I do want to quickly say, before I launch into this, that I really have become so impressed in my time here with Emily and Laura and the entire Nonprofit Institute. I was just saying to President Harris that if it didn't exist, we'd have to create it. It's important to have this sort of infrastructure, paying attention to this vital sector in our community. So hats off to everybody who's involved. I also do want to say, thank you to President Harris for giving me the grace to say a few words to you all before we sit down and do our conversation. When Emily invited me to do this with you, and I heard that the subject was the state of the nonprofit sector, you might imagine I have a few things to say about that. And I really wanted the opportunity to speak with you about what we see going on and what I think is really important to hold on to as we launch into what I hope will be a really long-term relationship. My slides are not as sophisticated as what you have just seen. So warning. But in fact, really what I just want to say, what I want to convey to you in the 20 minutes or so that I have to share some thinking with you is I want to touch on a bird, a poem, and a question. And we'll go through this as quickly as I can and get to the conversation with Jim. But I want to speak at a level about what it's like, I think, to be thinking about this sector for all of us right now. And maybe have a real conversation about that. One of the things I love about San Diego so far is this is an extraordinarily optimistic community. I wish I'd seen that before in my career. It's amazing. But it's also important sometimes to have real conversations about how hard the work is. Pat Libby opened with the concept of tikkun olam, and it's one of my favorite metaphors for all of philanthropy. The backstory behind that concept in Jewish lore is that there was originally a jar that contained all the light of the universe. And then there was an accident. Nobody's owned up to who caused the accident, but there was an accident, the jar shattered, and the light scattered all throughout the universe. And it's in little pieces in the heart of every human being. And the act of repairing the world is the act of bringing community back together. What a beautiful metaphor that is for what all of you do and for what we collectively, hopefully, will be doing together over the years to come. And in essence, that's what I want to talk with you about in my brief introduction here. So, one other thought. I was with Drew Moser yesterday, who told me that if I want to succeed in San Diego, I have to mention the Padres at the front of the So there you go. I've actually been to more Padres games than Pittsburgh Pirates games in the entire time I was in Pittsburgh, so I guess I'm a fan now. Do not let me down. All right, so I'm going to start with a piece of art. So for those of you who this piece of art hung over the space where I journaled every morning throughout the pandemic and everything that went on in it. And for those of you who can't quite make it out, this charcoal stuff coming down is called rain. You probably have heard of this. Some of you were referring to what happened this morning as rain. And this gray little bird huddled against the rain is obviously struggling to get through this downpour. And the name of the painting, written in the rye tone of the painter, is Goldfinch Caught in a Downpour. So the yellow down below is the color of the goldfinch that's been taken away. That was painted by my father, who's an artist and editorial cartoonist, as almost the last thing he painted right before he started to go blind. So it has an extraordinary amount of meaning for me, but it also became, during the course of the pandemic, a metaphor for what I was encountering for how people were feeling. Nonprofit leaders, and I think it's important to honor that, but also the people that the nonprofit community was serving, and in a broader sense, the country. There was a sense that we had lost our sparkle, our gold, our color, that we were struggling with deep questions in the wake of COVID and the handling of COVID and the racial reckoning and the handling in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. These questions persist now as we face the prospect of war and inflation and economic hardship. It's on the minds of a lot of people wondering, how do we get our energy back and our mojo back in a way? And some people even ask questions about, well, was it ever really real? You know, was the notion we had of ourselves an illusion? And these are pretty big questions to ask of a little bird. I did a lot of writing during the course of my journaling, during the course of the pandemic. But I share this with you here because I think I want to start by acknowledging that despite some of the positive findings of the survey, what I'm hearing in my conversations with a lot of you mirrors this pain. And you're struggling with two things at once, which is the optimism around your own work, but also the challenge of doing the work in the present environment, and also thinking about how much more the work can be. I believe that there are three, maybe four great thieves of our initiative. You know, there's a famous saying that it's not what life hands you, it's what you do with it. That can be misused by people of ill intent, but it can also be an incredibly empowering way of looking at the world. And there are at least three ways that we defeat ourselves in terms of embracing that notion. And to me, the greatest of the thieves is one that we've seen actually emerge recently, which is doomerism. Now, if you've spent any time online, you know that this is what people are saying. This is the sense that things are so messed up that we can't possibly fix them. And unfortunately, a lot of young people in our society have internalized this message on issues like climate change. And any good climate scientist will tell you that yes, we are in for some change, but it doesn't have to mean the end of the world. It has to, what matters now is what we do now. And so this sense of things being severe and to the point of hopelessness is one of the ways in which we rob ourselves of the sense of a capacity to respond and have agency against the very big challenges that we encounter. The others are, I don't have a slide for it, but I want to mention them because they're part of our society as well. One is indifference. There are plenty of people who over the course of the past 5 years have not experienced the same things that many of your clients have, or many of the organizations or people that you serve have. And for them, maybe the challenges that you're encountering every day don't feel as real as they do to you. And then the third is just a refusal to face facts, which is, I think, relatively new in our culture and society, but we're seeing the rise of it as a challenge for the work we all do. And it's important for us to keep that in mind in the context of the work we do, because part of what we have to persuade our society to do is change how it acts. When I look at a room full of nonprofit leaders and employees, staff, doing the work that you do, what I see are some of the most creative people in American society, working harder than in any other sector, with fewer resources and very often less credit than anyone else in the culture. When people talk about San Diego and they talk about the nonprofit sector, they will refer to, well, it's 10% of the economy. Yeah, actually, if you look at a payroll basis, it is 10% of the economy. But if you think about it from the context of what it contributes to the life of San Diego already, I want you to imagine San Diego without universities like this. Imagine San Diego without USD and UCSD and SDSU, and it's a dangerous game to mention specific universities if you're me, but I think it's important to acknowledge you have an extraordinary range of entities that are helping drive innovation and energy in the community, and they help form the rest of the economy and the economic future of the region. But I want you also to imagine San Diego without the arts organizations that get here, and not just the big ones, which are exceptional and incredibly important, but also the smaller ones that we find working in neighborhoods, giving life and vibrancy to the narratives of people in those neighborhoods. Where would San Diego be without those? And I can go on down a list of the ways in which the organizations here are helping to define the life of San Diego in a way that sometimes we don't get credit for. So it's important to acknowledge that we face challenges in this work, and it's important to acknowledge that sometimes those can be overwhelming. But when I came here, I was struck by, I was reminded of a poem by David Wagner called Lost that I've loved and used over the years. And in it, he basically writes about what it's like to feel like you're lost in the woods. And it is a wonderful metaphor for how we sometimes feel when circumstances suddenly change and the world becomes unfamiliar. So he uses the woods as an analogy, what it's like to be in there, not knowing where you're going. It's a great poem for somebody coming to a new city who suddenly knows no one and walks into a room full of strangers. What he says in the beginning to this poem is, stand still. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Must ask permission to know it and be known. I think our society and culture are finding ourselves in a position where we are dealing with a powerful stranger. What gets lost in the data that was just shared with you is the meta-narrative about the world and the country that we're dealing with, where suddenly everything feels confusing and we're being called upon to react and act in completely new and different ways. And I want to tell you that the drivers of a cultural response to that are in this room. The answer to that for our society is in this room, and in rooms like it around the country, in rooms that I had the privilege to be in Pittsburgh as well. The extraordinary energy and innovative thinking that we need to adopt to respond to these changing circumstances is going to come from the nonprofit sector. I'm convinced of that. And yes, working in concert with everybody else in community, and we will need everybody. But your role is signature and key. Part of being realistic about the circumstances that we're in is to acknowledge real challenges. So, why a black screen? It is meant to be black. Sometimes when you're lost in the woods and you're encountering this powerful stranger, it is overwhelming to think about the specific things that are really going on. And right now we have some specific things that I would pose by way of countering any illusions we might have because of the happy financial data that we just saw on the screen. What I'm hearing from organizations is that they're struggling financially. What I'm hearing from organizations is that donations are beginning to taper off. What I'm hearing from organizations is that leaders are worried about what inflation means, as we saw, but also what an imminent recession might mean. And preparing for that is an important part of the psychology of responding to a present moment. When you're lost in the woods, you have to acknowledge what's really happening. For the Conrad Prebys Foundation, as we've looked at this, what our board and staff have decided is that it means we have to step up our game. And that means talking about it, but it also means embracing more spending. And our board has already approved. Private foundations normally only give away 5% of their giving of their assets every year. We've already pushed that to 7% in anticipation of what's coming. Our board and staff have also had a conversation about not just the giving that we do through our grant making, but how we use our roughly $1 billion in assets. So we have adopted an intention to use those assets as part of an impact investing portfolio as well. So we can bring more of the resources of the foundation into play at a moment when it's necessary. And this is, I think, incumbent upon all of us as we think about the circumstances that we're entering into. It doesn't mean we have to be fearful. It doesn't mean that we have to be negative. It doesn't mean that we have to be doomist. It just means we have to be realistic about the fact that change is coming and it's important to prepare for change, and how might we each individually do that. So that's part of the planning that we're doing at the foundation. But I would also say that in my experience, the virtue of moments like this, where we're feeling uncertain and the earth is moving beneath our feet, that's an unfortunate metaphor in California. Works fine in Pittsburgh. But when we're feeling the whole world shift, is precisely the moment to be asking the big question. So the big question is, what actually wants to be born here in this moment? What is the opportunity at this moment? Let me tell you a quick story about Pittsburgh. So when I started working in the philanthropy sector in Pittsburgh, it was a city that had essentially had a near-death experience. It had had the biggest drop in population in the history of the United States, other than New Orleans in the wake of Katrina. And if you think about suddenly overnight losing 40% of your population, and what happens to a city when suddenly people disappear, and the industry that is known to drive the city, which in this case was steel, disappears, the thing that begins to set in is a sense that, well, first denial and wishing that you could get the past back, but the second is a sense that maybe our dreams need to be smaller. And in Pittsburgh's case, when I entered into this work, what I saw was a community struggling to have anything other than small ambitions. We were a town that felt like we should be lucky to take what we could get. And what began to turn that around was a community conversation led by foundations and nonprofits. It started with a group of us saying, what if the future of this town isn't about bringing back steel or about bringing back heavy industry, but is instead about reinventing our downtown based on art? What if it is instead about using our assets in innovation and entrepreneurism to drive this city as a center of green building design and sustainability? What if instead of people growing up being told, don't go near the rivers, we embrace the rivers and use them as a tool to reinvent how we think about the community? I remember an early op-ed that I worked on with Teresa Hines about this, and people basically laughed at the idea. Not at her, because they wouldn't dare, but they basically laughed at the idea. When I left Pittsburgh, it had one of the best world-class riverfronts in the United States of America. It was known as a green building and sustainability leader. There was a robust debate going on between the extractive industry sector and the environmental sector. Very important to the future of the region. And the downtown had survived when so many of our Rust Belt companion cities had died, precisely because art was at the center of the downtown. The question I keep asking myself since I've arrived in San Diego is not about how do we respond to each of the individual challenges that I've just touched on, or even necessarily what to make of each of the individual pieces of data that we need to look at that have just been shared with you. But what is San Diego's crazy aspirational narrative? What do we want that to be? Because the one thing I think San Diego needs to do next is step into its greatness. I think this town has, in my experience, and I hope you'll forgive me for being really East Coast and blunt, but I think this town has proven that it has greatness in its bones by creating something like Balboa Park a century ago, or by creating the Rady Shell. There's symbols of it around this community all over the place. And they tend to be driven by collectives of community coming together to think about what more the community can be and figuring out how to persuade the community to embrace that. And my question for all of us is, how are we going to work together on what that crazy, audacious dream needs to look like for San Diego next, at a level even higher than the Rady Shell or higher than Balboa Park? And I think what our planning is leading us to the conclusion of is that it all comes down to a reinvention of the city based not on a convergence of rivers as happened, or a confluence of rivers as happened in Pittsburgh, but on an extraordinary confluence of nations and people that happens here in San Diego. At the very moment when our country is so lost for purpose and divided, and at odds with itself over what the future of the country can be, there is something that can happen in San Diego that would represent a willingness to use innovation, entrepreneurship, but also the wealth of people that exist here to drive a different type of American narrative. And I think that's what we're seeing in our work that we want to have happen as a result of the Conrad Prebys Foundation's work over the course of the next decade. And I will tell you finally, before I apologize to President Harris for taking all his time, is the nonprofit sector is key in this. It won't happen. Again, to come back to what I started with, it will not happen without you. And so in our work, what we are looking at is how do we invest in the infrastructure and the collaboration that's already happening to support a strong and robust nonprofit sector across the platform of all our areas of work. And those areas of work point to a wonderful vision for what San Diego can be at the intersection of creativity, human wellness, and young people. So I look forward to the journey with you, and I just ask you to help answer that question as you reflect on the everyday challenges that you work on. At a bigger level, what is it we want to have be born here? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and I'm so excited now to have the president of the University of San Diego, Jim Harris, with you. And I have to tell you, we're so fortunate as an institution here on a hill to have a president that is really out and about in the community, but also with our students. And he's really brought a focus to the University of San Diego to be a committed anchor institution working in service of our community, as well as really investing in our rising leaders to be transformational change makers in the San Diego region and elsewhere around the globe. And the thing I've always noticed about President Harris that I really admire is that he really cares about our students. I'll come in here and I'll see him walking out of the canyon behind our building. He's just been on a walk with our students. He still teaches undergraduates here in this building about leadership, and I think it says a lot about him. And he serves on nonprofit boards, and he'll tell you a little bit about that. But I'm so excited about that, and I think it says a lot about who he is and what he stands for today, because he tells me now that he's very impatient about kind of the state of change and how much more we have to do, because he's thinking every day about that next generation. So I'll leave it to you two now to take this conversation.
And she read that just as I wrote it. Thank you. We are blessed to have Emily and Laura and our team at the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego. There isn't a meeting where I leave with them that I don't come away optimistic, positive, and I know they're a treasured talent, and I appreciate the support that you've given, and it's an honor to be with all of you today. You know, Grant, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this Padre thing. So when I came here, I was interviewing in 2015, and I was interviewing with the search committee, and I was supposed to meet the chairman of the board, who at that time was Ron Fowler, one of the owners of the Padres. So I walked up to him, I said, Mr. Fowler, my name's Jim Harris. It's a pleasure to meet you. I have one thing I want to share with you. I've only lived in 2 other cities that had Major League Baseball. One was in 1990 in Cincinnati, and one was in 2008 in Philadelphia. They both won the World Series. I'm just saying, I think I'm a lucky charm. He didn't even pause. He didn't say hello. He turns to Constance Carroll, who was the chair of the search committee, and said, "We found our man." So I've got big shoes. I got to live up to that.
Great.
Welcome to San Diego.
I wish I carried that karma with me.
That's right.
I come from Pittsburgh.
You were there in 1979, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
We got museums to that.
Well, thank you for everyone being here today. I was supposed to say just a few words about the university and about me. First of all, we're very proud of the university's focus on rankings and ratings and so forth, but it's really about what we do in our community that matters the most. In my inaugural address, I talked about if we want to be a great global university, we need to be a great local university, and we're still falling short in that area. We're trying to find ways that we can work with all of you. My own personal involvement has been with the Monarch School here locally. I'm chairing the board there, to work with unhoused youth, and how we're going to scale that up and try to be a greater support to unhoused youth around this community and around the state and around the country. And so the university, I think what I'm most proud about the university is 2 years ago there was a rating that came out from an organization called Washington Monthly, and they talked about what schools in America, universities, do the most for our country. And they measure it in a couple different ways. What percentage of your students volunteer in the local community? What percentage of your students vote? what percentage of your students go into the military, into leadership roles, what percentage go into the Peace Corps, and what percentage also offer a service to America in AmeriCorps and all the different service organizations. And the number one university in the country was the University of San Diego. Thank you. We're very proud of that, and that's due to incredible faculty, incredible people like Laura and Emily and what we do here, and for your support. So thank you so much. So let's get to the most important part here, is to talk a little bit about your background. First of all, Grant, to understand who you are and how you got into this field. What informed my decision to, for example, be of service to the homeless is that my mother and I were unhoused at one point in our life, so it's always stuck with me. And so to think about that kind of experience, also my grandmother was a refugee, so I've always been involved in issues around immigration and treatment of refugees. What informed you as someone who's involved in the philanthropy community? What are some of those?
Well, my name is Grant.
You had no choice in the matter.
Right, it's destiny. I've wondered about this a lot, and I think everybody comes into this work differently, but in my case, I was very much drawn to what I call work that matters, because my grandmother was a member of the Dutch underground who nearly died during World War II as a result of her work. My parents, my mom's family moved after the war to Australia and lived in a refugee camp for a period of time before being assigned to a work location. And then we moved as an immigrant family to Denver, Colorado when I was a kid. And then I grew up in a house where, aside from the usual range of family issues that happen with every family, I also had a dad who was very active in political cartooning, and so politics was a daily part of life. My mother was really driven to empower people at a personal psychology level. And so they had a sense of, there was always a sense in the household of wanting to help people and make a difference. And also a really healthy skepticism of authority. Not directed at my parents, but there was a true skepticism of an intent to question.
That's beautifully said, and your words were inspiring today. I'm sure you were inspired by your family. It's pretty clear. When you think about the report that you mentioned a little bit about how you view the data and what we're seeing here in San Diego, what else stands out for you? There was a question back here earlier about what surprised you. Is there a surprise in the report?
I was actually surprised by the health of the financial data, which I mentioned. I think that's being experienced, as the data also reveals, that's being experienced very differently by organizations based on size. And I do worry that there's a lagging effect in terms of where we are now versus where we were at the beginning of the summer in terms of that data. So some of it may be the same, some of it may have changed, but I think we're looking at harder times ahead based on what we're hearing about recession than that number would suggest. So I'm just struggling with that number more than anything else.
I listened to a podcast at the end. They asked the reporters, what can't you let go of? Is that the piece that you can't let go of? Is there something else in the report that you're churning?
Well, the D- for philanthropy.
On
On the other hand, as the new student, it's like maybe we can go up now. we got something to aspire to.
Our sector got enough, so
yeah.
That's hard think
I may
higher
be
ed-
being generous with the D minus. I don't know.
You know, one point with the higher ed sector, and I know we have other colleagues here from other institutions that you did mention, like UC, or Cal State San Marcos, and also the San Diego Community College System, really wonderful, Point Loma and others. I saw some data that suggested that we're the #3 city in the country for college students. So it's Boston, it's Philadelphia, it's San Diego in terms of the college students in this region. So there might be something there also, as you mentioned, as part of that.
Well, that also reminds me of another piece of the report that did strike me and I think is really, really significant, which is that people in San Diego trust the nonprofit sector and really, I think, feel positively about the nonprofit sector and kind of take it for granted. You know, there's a sense that it doesn't need to be supported. I can't tell you how many jokes I've heard about low salaries in the sector being compensated for by the sunshine tax. And you know, if you're wondering why people are leaving the sector and it's hard to hire, you know, we got to put pieces together. And I think San Diego, maybe like many communities, this is not unique to this town, but the data suggests our own unique maybe experience of it. There's a need for the nonprofit community here to get more attention and to be acknowledged for what it is. And the universities are a perfect example to me. My board and I have had this conversation that when we think about the impact of the nonprofit sector on San Diego, as I was saying in my comments, it is way beyond being 10% of the economy. I think Qualcomm spun out of UCSD and has 200 companies at this point that spun out of Qualcomm. So, you know, if you go back to why there is such a robust innovation and entrepreneurship sector here, it is in very large part because of the educational resources that exist here. And so the vitality of the future of San Diego is it makes this, you know, where transitions take decades. So you can think of San Diego as already being through the transition from being a military town to an innovation town. But the fact is, we got all these amazing parts of the economy and they're still in play, and they're fragile to the extent that they depend on maybe things that people don't normally think of, like the role of the nonprofit community in making them happen.
Let's move to your background a little bit in Pittsburgh, and I had a quote from the mayor of Pittsburgh that called you a true leader in the rebirth of Pittsburgh. For those of you who are not familiar with the Heinz and the Pittsburgh Foundations, we're talking about world-class organizations. And so when I saw that the Conrad Prebys Foundation had hired Grant, I knew we were getting somebody who really looks at this in a broad way and is going to bring quite a bit of skill and leadership to our community. Looking back on your experience in Pittsburgh, is there something interesting from that background that kind of informs what you're going to bring to San Diego, or any stories from Pittsburgh that you want to share with us?
I got stories about Philadelphia if you want.
Yeah, I know. If you're not from the East, you know that Philadelphia and Pittsburgh do not get along, but that's it.
Yeah, that's right. So the chief among them is the one I just touched on in my comments. I should also add, in terms of my entry into philanthropy, I had no clue what foundations were when I was first invited to a job in this arena. In fact, so I was working for John Heinz in the U.S. Senate as his press secretary when he died in a terrible plane crash in 1991. And his widow, Teresa, asked me if I would come and work for her and the family in the family foundation. And I said no, because I had no clue what a foundation was, and I thought that my life was going to go in another direction. I think 2 years later, I begged her to hire me when I figured it out what it is. What I think philanthropy can do, and what I think the nonprofit sector can collectively do, is again, drive the adoption in our culture and in our society of new ways of thinking and new models of response. Just from the conversations I've had with your fellows, the Conrad Prebys fellows here this morning, and with various folks in this audience who I've had the privilege to speak with before, lots of you are wrestling with changing models. And I think the part of the responsibility of philanthropy is to help the nonprofit sector do that, respond to you in different ways. But collectively, what I learned in Pittsburgh is we have the opportunity to change the narrative of a region, and we have the opportunity through changing the narrative of a region to change the narrative of the country. I was asked the other day by I was giving a talk to the San Diego Refugees Coalition, and somebody asked me this very pointed question about what do you hope to accomplish while you're here? And if I sound a little impatient, what I hope to accomplish is I think this is an extraordinary town with amazing assets that, like the nonprofit sector, it sometimes undervalues. And I want to help do whatever we can as a foundation to help San Diego really embrace those and its collective wisdom and step into its greatness and do something awesome. That's what I think philanthropy can do.
Wow, that's inspiring. Thank you. You mentioned in your talk, and I've read quite a bit about your background with regard to your commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, inclusive excellence, and it feels to me that that's one of the real assets of San Diego that we don't leverage as well. Could you expand on that a little bit, talk a little bit about that?
Well, coming from Pittsburgh, where yes, we worked extensively on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. And it was a huge value for me in my work. But what was interesting about Pittsburgh was that immigration stopped in Pittsburgh in the 1970s because of the collapse of the economy. So it was largely a black-white community. Part of what attracted me to San Diego is that it's a lots of people community, and I love that about this town. And I wonder if it's seen as the strength that it is. It's when I talk about a convergence of nations, for me that also includes the Kumeyaay people, and when I think about the multiplicity of folks who are represented in San Diego, I think that's a strength that can help the rest of the country how to figure out how to move past othering and alienation and division and embrace a more inclusive view of what American society can be. I think it's a huge strength of the community if we step into it. But like anything else, we have to step into it.
Thank you. How much time do we have?
We have another 7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay. Let's talk about the foundation, about the Conrad Prebys Foundation, sizable assets, quite a bit of energy around the idea that you can help create something here that is pretty special. You want to talk a little bit about your vision for the future of the foundation and where you think we're heading?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to pay tribute to what Conrad did, which is extraordinary in American philanthropy. Because there's a debate going on in American society about the role of philanthropy and its value. But what Conrad did was basically hand over 99% of his fortune to the good of the community. And this is a community-controlled board. It will be a community-controlled entity as an independent foundation, and that doesn't happen in philanthropy. So that's to give San Diego its largest private foundation was an extraordinary and I think selfless gift, and it sets up San Diego rather nicely to begin to build on that base. So part of the aspiration for the foundation that the board and I have embraced is we hope that we'll encourage more of that, that we will encourage even more philanthropy. This is a town that's on the cusp of an extraordinary shift in that you have incredibly wealthy living donors, which we would have killed to have those folks back in Pittsburgh, by the way. You have incredibly wealthy, and they are generous. They're willing to give, and the question is what happens to that wealth when they're no longer with us. And we hope that the work we do will help set a template for why this matters for the future of San Diego. So that's part of it. We have adopted a notion for our giving that we want to put the concept of community well-being at the center of it. Community well-being is a pretty well understood concept that has three core elements. A well community, or a well neighborhood, or a well person has a sense of purpose. They sort of know what they're doing when they get up in the morning and what they're about and what drives them in life. They have a sense of opportunity. They actually have means to pursue that purpose and means of making a living and making ends meet. And they have a sense of belonging. They feel respected. They feel part of the community. And we want to create that community for all San Diegans. So we have embraced a core vision of creating a future and a community for all San Diegans that is inclusive, equitable, and dynamic.
Thank you. That's beautiful. How about a round of applause for that? I have this one last question that we didn't get to earlier, and it speaks to you, the individual, and that is, tell us about your novel, Ring of Years.
Oh, God, no. Okay, I wrote a novel I wrote two novels actually in my 30s. One I actually sold to Random House, and they didn't publish it. They broke my heart. I set it aside. I wrote another one that also didn't get published. That broke my heart, so I gave it up. And I would encourage any aspiring writer or artist in the audience, don't do that. Because it will bite you in the backside years later, and so one day I woke up and I realized, there's this thing called the internet, and I found somebody who wanted to publish it, even though they were only an online publisher, but it would allow the book to be out there. So I wrote a book called The Ring of Years, and it was great fun. It's very dark. I was sort of thinking through the implications of cults in our society, and so I wrote a thriller about that. But the more important thing about this is I want the artist, everybody in this room probably has some passion that they pursue. And I paid a psychological price for a decade and a half by giving up that side of my personality. And I'm kind of glad that it's out there. But I'm not writing another one right now.
All the time. Well, thank you so much for your wonderful words and inspiration. We're so glad to have you in our community. How about a round of applause?